Hello and welcome to episode 17 of the Frame and Sequence podcast. My name is Todd Rittendaro, and in this episode I chat with Sean Conaty. Sean is an Emmy award-winning cinematographer based in Los Angeles. He has lensed a wide variety of projects, everything from music videos and commercials to narrative feature films, and his work is played at Sundance, Cannes, and Berlin. In addition to his cinematography, he is also an accomplished photographer exploring deeply personal themes in his work. In this episode, we dive into Sean's background in philosophy and how it has influenced him as a filmmaker, how he approaches a project, and some very creative ways of thinking. We also chat about his personal photography and how he brings that into his professional projects. We also get into some of the films and filmmakers that have influenced him over the years, as well as some of his personal interests outside of film and photography that keep him inspired and the creativity flowing. I've admired Sean's work for a long time, and this chat was a real treat for me. He shares a lot of inspiring gems in this one, and I hope you enjoy. Hey, Sean.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you? Thanks so much for having me over and for doing this. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
One of the reasons I was excited to reach out to you to talk is because every time I see one of your images on Instagram, I know it's yours before I even read the name.
I appreciate that.
So how long have you been in doing cinematography?
Let's see, I guess professionally probably over 10 years at this point. I went to USC Film School for grad school, studied cinematography there, graduated from there in about 2008.
Did you go to undergrad for film?
No, I actually studied philosophy undergrad. I thought I was going to be a lawyer. Yeah, I was simultaneously about 4 or 5 different majors in school. I was, interested in history and political science and literature, and then all of a sudden I just took a random film class my sophomore year of college, and within about 10 minutes I knew that this is exactly what I wanted to do with my life. And at that point I didn't know that it was cinematography specifically. I just saw that I could combine absolutely everything that I was interested in. And so the funny thing about philosophy was that it was the one major that had the fewest requirements, and so it did allow me to take classes in other departments, and so that's how I then took that film class, and then I ended up graduating a year early from college and just moved out here, applied to USC, got in, and then kind of just sort of bounced while I was in school. USC was great because it had a 3-year program, so you got to experiment in a lot of different just sort of avenues of filmmaking, and I think that their sort of philosophy is very much kicking you out as a consummate filmmaker who kind of understands how all the departments interrelate. The sort of double-edged sword is you kind of start, you spend about that first year kind of barking up a ton of different trees. And in my case, what ended up happening was, I kept making the same bad short film after another, same bad student film, and the criticism was was like, hey, this film is terrible, but it looks great. Maybe you should consider a career in cinematography. And I was devastated, I think, at first, because I was like, oh yeah, well, I'm going to be a director. And it was just like, no, it's like, this is so much the way that my brain works, is that fusion of, how do you find those images that don't require the words, and how do you kind of communicate that story in this sort of like distilled 4-walled frame. So. Oh,
that's so interesting.
Yeah.
I went to NYU for film and had always felt like from a distance that USC prepared people better for the actual industry. I don't know if that's true. Was that your experience?
I think it depends. I think anybody would say this is that it is what you make of it. I had a lot of criticisms of my experience and the sort of expensive experience that USC grad school was. But what it did provide me was just sort of bubble for 3 years. To make a ton of mistakes. I worked on my friend. I got a better technical education working in my friends' AFI sets.
Yeah.
So I would work, I would work as a juicer or a grip on, their projects. There was a DP who I, was her second AC for, and she's still been a mentor of mine, Stephanie Martin. And she just gave me a ton of really great advice, and just really great technical, but also more career advice. But I don't think that I would have had that sort of freedom of exploring different projects had I not, or, just as a, working crew, had I not been at USC. And I think that that's sort of what they foster, is just, hey, we're not going to, maybe give you the perfect way of lighting it, but we're going to, you're going to figure out your way of lighting it. And I think I really appreciated that about the education.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Do you remember any specific piece of advice that she gave you?
Yeah, she gave me a lot of really good pieces of advice. The one was, she's like, yeah, you love your classmates, you think they're super talented, but for the first 5 years out of school, they're not going to be in a position to hire you just yet. So figure out a way of expanding your network, figuring out a way of meeting new directors, new producers. And it was funny. It was almost like clockwork within, obviously there were projects that I would do with, people that I had gone to school with, but they weren't paying my bills at that point. And so it was really just, it was that advice of like, you need to go out and promote yourself. You need to figure out ways of meeting new people so that by the time that those people are in, your friends, your classmates that you went to school with are in a position to hire you, then you've sort of built that resume and that credit base. And she ended up being totally right, because then, it's like only now, I guess I've been out for 10 years, but, within 5 years, it was then like, okay, now my friends are starting to do more legitimate commercial work and more legitimate feature work. And that was really, it ended up coming to bear.
Right.
So, yeah.
Oh, that is great advice.
Yeah.
Were you inspired or by any other films or filmmakers that time in your education that you were trying to learn from by emulating or just inspired by?
Really great question. I think there was I would say the big three for me when I was in school were probably Scorsese, Malick, and Paul Thomas Anderson.
It's a good trilogy.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think PTA for me is still number one. I think that Scorsese was I think I probably wrote 5 or 6 different papers on Taxi Driver when I was in college, because what I really loved about that movie specifically that really helped me understand that like you could do a lot more with film and filmmaking than just purely entertain people, was that you could kind of infuse it with a lot of substance underneath it.
Right.
And I think that what I really enjoyed about dissecting that film was that on one level it does hit you on an entertaining level. It isn't just drivel. It isn't just navel gazing of, a movie that collapses under the weight of its own ideas. But then conversely, it also is so built up with comments on, contemporary political science and, theology and just a philosophical basis, but then also just like a filmmaking basis that I was like, oh, you can do this with this medium, and this is our contemporary medium in a way that I think I had never really understood possible.
Right.
I'd always kind of approached it. It's like, well, that's what literature's for, is to be able to have substance and, kind of explore the mind in that way, but not something that I thought that film was really interesting, was not capable of, but just something that I'd never really pursued at all.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that film for me was also,
Yeah.
I must have seen it 100 times. I wrote a paper on it at one point. I think, yeah, probably. But yeah, that was the first time that it opened up my eyes to how important composition was.
Yeah.
Like in terms of, there's a scene that I remember so vividly where he's in a diner and
Yeah.
there's all these people and he's always isolated
Yeah.
in the frame. It's like, oh, like there's intent with every shot in that movie. Yeah.
It's funny. I would say Magnolia is the movie that made me want to make movies, but there's a movie. It was sort of that was the one where I saw just that there was so much energy and just so much freedom and creativity to filmmaking that I think I had never really considered before.
Yeah.
But it was actually and I do this still. It was within like the first 10 minutes of watching The Graduate. my film teacher, and he's still a good friend of mine. I mean, he was at my wedding, and he's just been a really great mentor of mine. Wow. This was back in college. He would break down these scenes for us, and he would just say, like, these aren't accidental choices. These things didn't just make their way onto screen for you to feel this way. And even if you're not conscious or can even articulate these kind of reactions, they were intentional decisions on the part of the filmmakers. And
right.
I think just to be able to all of a sudden feel like that was a power within my grasp as a storyteller, as an artist, was not something that I just had never even considered possible before.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
That's very cool. You obviously jump around you've done docs and
Sure.
narrative shorts, narrative
Yeah.
features, music videos, commercials. Do you have a favorite?
Oh man, I hate this question.
That's good.
Yeah, let's go with this one. I would say that Incel, which is directed by John Marzaldi, is the favorite thing that I've done, that I've shot. Going back to what we talked about before, it was just very intentional filmmaking.
Right.
It's a story within a world that John has always been interested in, and it started with a really great script, but then it just became how do we tell this story in a respectful way? How do we tell this story in a way that still has a point of view. That wasn't necessarily, oh, the camera then therefore needs to be subjective. There was still a distance that was important to us. But I think more than anything else, it was just that exploration of how are we going to tell this incredibly difficult story. And I think John brought the right just sort of sensibility and approach to it.
Yeah.
It wasn't intended to be sensational or sort of provocative for the sake of. It definitely provokes, but I think that just the trust that he and I have from having worked together for so long, we really were committed to and believed in what we did. And I think just, you know, the acclaim that it's got since then is a nice validator, but it was also one of those things where it just, as we were making it and as we were, you know, really just almost staying out of the way of some of the performances that we were getting, it was just so refreshing. It's like, no, this is what we want to be doing.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
So, yeah.
Do you prefer narrative over everything else?
It's a good question. It's what I got in. It's what I got into it to do. But I also really love shooting commercials. You know, I love the storytelling aspect of narrative. I think that there's an exploration of. There's just an exploration that's more interesting to me. I think in many ways the cinematography rightfully needs to take a back seat, and for commercials it's much more foregrounded visuals. I think I'm much more interested in I think subtlety within storytelling and not having it be so readily apparent right off the bat. But I think I just like the kind of, you know, the quickness of it. You know, I mean, this car commercial that we shot in New Orleans, we shot it on a Tuesday and it aired that Saturday.
Wow.
So there's a, you know,
That's
and
pretty
it was,
incredible.
and it's, you know, it's got polish and it's, you know, it's high value. And I think that was refreshing to be able to put so much time and energy and effort into, you know, something that didn't have to wait then 2 years before it then could be appreciated or seen.
For sure. Yeah. That's often It's often the struggle with film.
Yeah, it's,
or
you know,
features.
I mean, even narratives, features, or, you know, shorts or features, or, you know, any project is just there's a stamina required.
Yeah.
There's a larger, obviously, investment required. So yeah,
For sure. Something you hinted at was, you know, hiding some of the shots and storytelling, but working on a subtle level. Did that take you a while to arrive at, or was there a conscious moment where you were like, okay, this is how it sort of, or how you approach it?
It's funny. I think I probably vacillate. There are certain cinematographers whose work is almost just so invisible. I mean, Harris Savitas is a huge influence for me. And then it's funny that I'll go so far down that rabbit hole, and then I'll swing to the other side, and, you know, I'll go watch I'll watch Casino or watch a, you know, Tarantino, Bob Richardson film, and there's just such a bravado to the imagery that sometimes you do need to herald to the audience, like, hey, this is an important moment. There's this I read this book last year. It's the David Byrne How Music Works books, and he was talking about how in, you know, it's a specifically a theater thing, which is like, you know, a thing can't just happen. It has to sort of be prepared. Specifically in theater, like, there has to be something that, you know, it has to be the character walking around the sort of stage to draw your eye, to tell you, hey, a moment is about to occur. And I think that too often, especially in, you know, I think some of the cinematography that I'm drawn to, or even that I do, it's just sort of like subtlety above all else becomes the sort of guiding principle, and you forget that, again, you still want to make bold images. You still want to make things that people look at and go, wow.
Right.
And and so for me, it's always just this kind of pendulum swing between, you know, and that's, I think, what I also enjoy about commercials is that sometimes it is hey, you're meant to hang back. You're meant to, you know, if it's a very documentary style commercial or whatnot, like, it's not about spending 4 hours on a lighting setup. It's, you know, with a pre-light and, you know, whatnot. It is, you know, hey, you're showing up, you don't know what the location looks like, make it work, but also it's not about you.
Right. Yeah.
And that's you know, that's kind of its own necessary learning experience.
Yeah.
So
most of my shorts in film school were heavily inspired by Bob Richardson and JFK specifically. I was obsessed with that movie. Do you find that some of the things you think about from the philosophy side have woven their way into your visuals?
It's a really good question. I wish I had a better retention of what I studied and learned in school, but I think at the very least what it taught me was just almost brain patterning in terms of problem solving, and I think that that's probably the most directly applicable piece of the education that I got, which is the identification of a problem, the deconstruction of that problem, the then sort of being able to put the pieces together in the right order in an almost three-dimensional space sometimes in your brain to be able to then figure out all the permutations and consequences
Right.
of your potential solution to that problem.
Yeah.
And then it's all theoretical until you actually have to. I think what's fun for me in terms of the departure from philosophy into filmmaking was that philosophy for me always felt like it was very much this academic, inapplicable study that then I was able to bring into filmmaking, where it is much more about decision making, and it is much more about the confidence that you bring to your ideas and your executions.
Right. Did you ever gravitate towards one philosophical school of thought?
Yeah, I studied a lot of Kierkegaard and a lot of Nietzsche. There was a class that I took. Again, it was about the sort of like the applicability of philosophy that was what was so fascinating to me, and it was about very much philosophy and modernism, but modernism specifically as it affected literature, specifically in Britain. And I just really was interested in that transitional period of the end of the empire, and how did, on a very existential level, how did Great Britain, through its artists, come to terms with its new identity. And that was something that was always, whether it was T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, Evelyn Waugh, like these were all authors that I was interested in. But I think it was, this wasn't a movement that came from purely, it didn't emerge from nothing, it emerged from ideas. And so to be able to dissect those ideas that presupposed that,
right,
or preceded it, was really interesting for me.
Yeah,
so
that's super fascinating stuff. For sure. Very cool. So do you find that there's certain stories that you gravitate towards?
Yeah. Yes. It's funny, there's a feature I did in Georgia, in Savannah, a couple of years ago, and the director, I had never done this before, but his whole theory is that he's like, we all have these stories and these themes that we're drawn to. And it's no, I think a lot of times we think it's the sort of like, aesthetic preferences, or I just really like things that look like this, but we sort of forget that substantively there are core stories that just drive us, that we relate to, that we don't relate to. And, for me, what I've really been able to identify, I have this conversation with my agents of just like, let's find things like this. I'm really, I just read East of Eden, and it just really kind of broke open this whole other piece of my brain where I was like, I'm really interested in these stories about generational trauma. All the King's Men was another one that I just read recently, where it's just taking these things that have happened in previous generations, whether it's one before or 200, 150 years before, and then seeing the seeds of that planted then are sown, in that sort of present story, and whether or not those things can be escaped from, I think is just a theme that I've always been interested in, just personally. I think there's another theme specifically is very much, I would just say, you're kind of David and Goliath stories, almost underdogs. There's, when I was talking with that director, he was asking me, and I think I had just seen, I think Michael Clayton had just come out.
Oh, yeah.
And it's the same kind of deal where it's very much this sort of, I wouldn't say anti-hero, but it's very much a, never do well, down on his luck, just this character who is able to completely subvert this from the inside, this almost just faceless system. And I think that's really, those kinds of stories I'm just always drawn to.
Yeah, for sure. I love those as well. So, yeah.
I would say the other ones, I guess I'm a sucker for mother-son stories too.
Oh, nice.
there's a theme in a lot of the photography that I do that is just my mom is completely fascinating to me. She's got a really interesting story, and there's, I think I will always, in my photography and in those stories, be exploring just kind of a better understanding of her. Yeah. And so there's this kind of motif that shows up in a lot of the photos that I do, and it's based on a photo that I took of her from behind, and it's from the back of her head. And it's funny because I found this again in another moment. I was down in Australia and I saw the same exact moment happen with a woman who had very similar hair to her.
Wow.
And, you know, and then really just kind of finding myself gravitating to specifically this kind, like this sort of image over and over and over again. And it's just this constant sort of conversation that I'm having back and forth with her, even though she's not present, but it's using these sort of surrogate strangers, you know, in the process.
That's super interesting.
Yeah.
Do you do a lot of personal photography?
I do. You know, there was a point a couple of years ago where I think I went so far down the kind of commercial rabbit hole where you realize that there's not, or you don't think that there's a whole lot of you personally expected within your work. You, I think, very much approach it as a how do I be the best technician possible, and not necessarily how do I be the best, you know, human being, storyteller, artist possible.
Right.
And I would go from job to job, and it was just very much like there's none of me in my work. And yet in my photography, my stills work, it's very personal. It's very much just me working out themes from my childhood and kind of really exploring those. And it was I worked with Bonnie Taylor. She was at the Icon before. And eventually she just looked, you know, I would just start printing there. And she's like, well, when are you going to do your own show? And so it was really her encouragement and my wife's encouragement as well to just kind of invest that time in myself. And that took, you know, 8 or 9 months to put that show together. But it was very much just a different moment of me being able to use my voice in a way that I don't think was, I didn't even think there was a space for that in cinematography, specifically commercial cinematography.
Right.
But the interesting thing was that having to articulate myself both photographically, but then also have to write words and talk about that show allowed me to then speak more clearly visually in my cinematography work to be like, hey, this is how I can infuse this particular scene or this moment in a way that reminds me of something from my childhood or whatever it is, but having those conversations with my directors as opposed to copying and pasting looks that we both were drawn to but didn't really feel the space was there to be able to have those personal conversations.
Totally.
And so just bringing that intimacy to the work, I think for me was really where the personal photography work has found its way back into the cinematography.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's interesting on your just on your Instagram feed. I was going through a lot of your work this week, but it was really hard to tell what was a still from a film versus just a still photo that you took. Which is why I felt like there was a very cohesive voice to everything you did.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Are you working on any personal photos now?
No, I would say right now it's just a lot of different like technique exploration. So there isn't a story that's sort of dying to get out of me at the moment, in terms of photography, but there are a lot of different ways of expressing myself that are coming out that are really interesting. And so whether it's just, I've just been doing a lot of different things photochemically that I think I never would have felt comfortable doing before, but it's just kind of like, well, what do you have to lose? It's one roll.
Right.
And then finding these really happy accidents that I'm then able to bring into another way of articulating an idea. I go up to Big Sur a lot. My wife and I go up there, and what's great is it's the same stretch of coastline, but every time you go up, it's just different. And I have, from this exact vantage point, so many different photographs, and it's almost sort of like a benchmark of my kind of growth as a photographer.
Yeah,
to go back through them, but I just got this a couple rolls of film back yesterday, and it's just I was trying stuff that I just had never done before, and I'm so excited to see all of these kind of different elements coming together and just really kind of having that pay off in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you shoot most of your personal work on film?
Yeah, almost all of it. I mean, I really didn't bite. The only digital camera I had for a long time was just an iPhone. And I really, and it just sort of became, at first that was sort of like cute, and then it became kind of professionally irresponsible with scouts and whatnot. I was borrowing cameras, and I just was like, okay, bite the bullet, get yourself a digital SLR. Yeah, that's how I learned how to shoot photography when I was in college. It was black and white 35, and then, for me, it's just kind of bouncing back and forth between 35 and medium format, just sort of depending on circumstances, environment, almost also just kind of like what sort of stories do I want to tell, I love there was a point, I think, where I was full on fetishizing the medium, and I think that my wife has been really helpful in terms of my growth as a photographer. Photographs that I would just obsess over, that I was like, I think this is really great, and she's like, well, I look terrible in it, and this isn't a very good photograph, and I'd be like, but the photochemical processes that I did to make it look this way, and she's like, I don't care, this photograph is completely useless. And so to be able to not so much look at the technical aspect and really pull back and say, like, nobody cares what you shot it on, but is there emotional resonance to that image? And if so, I mean, I'll show you the biggest photograph that, for that show that I did was one that was captured on an iPhone, and that had a better, for me, it wasn't about the resolution, it just had a better quality to what I was going for,
right,
than any of the medium format images that also could have been at a similar scale.
Yeah, so, I hear you on that.
Yeah.
I mean, I love shooting whenever I travel, and pounding the pavement, getting sunrises and not getting a single shot, and then you get one on the way to breakfast.
I mean, honestly, it's one of the best things about being a commercial DP is that you fly in, you scout the next day, and then you usually have 2 down days before you're shooting.
Yeah. And
so I just use those opportunities to just walk around, and I'll walk 15, 18 miles, on those days, and just explore, because it's, when else am I going to be here? And I've just completely fallen in love with some cities as a result of it, because I just, somebody else is paying for me to go explore a city and take photographs of it. Like, you kidding me?
Do you feel like you have a favorite focal length that you gravitate towards?
That's really funny. It's all, I think, similar in the exploration. It's all different. For a long time there was a, on 35, there's a 28 that I have that I just absolutely love. Mm-hmm. I studied a lot of art history growing up. I mean, we moved around a lot when I was growing up, and so I was really fortunate. I got to go to a lot of museums, all throughout Europe and the rest of the world, and there was a very strong, almost I would say, like, formalist education, and so it was very much like rigid and rule of thirds and very proscenium, very presentational. And it's been one of the hardest things for me to break, is moving away from that, just sort of like trying to tell every single element of this story within this frame. And it's almost a sort of like, I need to give you the full context of the story. The problem is that there's sort of no mystery at that point. And so for me, what's this sort of progression has been, hey, I don't need to tell you everything. You can probably fill in the blanks. I don't need to, you don't need to see every element. And so for me, it's been much more kind of, going with longer lenses, or even on wider lenses, just, extending the frame, making it not be so everything in its right place, rectilinear, perfectly composed, and just really being, it's funny, because I think I look at the work of a lot of other photographers, and that just seems so second nature to them. And for me, one of my struggles is really just sort of, how do you tell the story? How do you communicate that mood, and yet have it be so incomplete? I think is just always, from a sort of conception to execution gap, a challenge for me.
Yeah. I can definitely relate to that. I mean, I feel like I just take the same picture over and over now.
But I think we all do. I think that's the thing. It's all just a distillation of a lot of those really elemental or formational visual ideas that you could really extract it and almost look at the skeleton of all your images and be like, I'm doing the exact same thing that I've been doing for the last 15 years.
Yeah, but it is exciting when you take one, or at least for me, when I take one that's maybe accidentally a different thing, and you're like, oh wait, what's this road here?
Yeah. And it's I didn't know I was capable of this. How did I do this?
Yeah. But for me though, if I bring the intellectual back into it, that's where everything freezes back up. So
it's funny. I am the exact same way if I think about it too much. And that's where I think now for me, it's mostly just about experimenting with technique. And just trying to find just different ways of not doing it the exact same way that I've always done it, and then expecting different results.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Do you have any photographers who you refer back to?
Kudelka is probably one of my favorites.
Yeah.
There's a South African photographer. His name is Guy Tillum. I worked on a movie in Mozambique about 10, 12 years ago, and I was a camera assistant on it, and it was indie movie. It never saw the light of day, unfortunately, but in the kind of researching of that area, I was just looking for different photographers, and he's one who's based in Cape Town, and he's got this really amazing hybrid of reportage with fine art photography, which I would just say is exactly what I'm mostly drawn to.
Yeah.
Is that it's not just photojournalism, but then it's also not on the opposite side of it, totally conceptual. And he has just this eye and this artistry towards telling stories, and specifically being over there, there's a series called Joburg that is just absolutely mind-blowing.
Cool.
So yeah, I always go back to the two of them.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
When you're diving into a feature or even a shorter piece, do you like a lot of research? Do you like pull a lot of visual reference?
It's funny. There's a director who I worked with last year for the first time. He's a good friend of mine, and he gave me the challenge, and I try to do this on every job since then. He gave me the challenge. He's like, instead of just going to your computer or go to your photo books and kind of copy and paste the things that you think are in the vein of what this is, I want you to meditate for 30 minutes. I want you to clear your brain if you can, and I want you to just think about what this project is and how you can do something different. And similarly, it was a commercial, but it was the culmination of a lot of things that he and I had been talking about. And he's like, I just want you to do something different on this. Like, let's explore, let's experiment. And what that experience did of just not doing that sort of very agitated brain, go immediately to the 5 commercials within that genre that immediately come to mind, that you copy and paste and send to the director and say, like, I think it should look like this. We instead approached it in a different way, and I was so also proud of that project because it was coming from a more personal experience.
Yeah.
So again, that's not to say that I don't also still do that on, do the image polls. I have a pretty extensive library on my computer and my, all my books and whatnot.
Yeah. On that one, did you find that you pulled, or some images came to you out of left field that you wouldn't have even thought
Completely.
of? Yeah.
And it was oddly enough, it was about movement, which came. And I think that was, even on this one that I just did with this hockey commercial, John and I realized that we were sharing a lot of images but not talking enough about movement. And I think that so often now, in terms of cinematography, it's about specific image pulls, and it's less about how do you use the movement of the camera to communicate and translate emotion.
Right.
And so on that one previously, there were movement ideas that were coming to my brain that were as a result of the music that he was asking me to listen to, that never would have happened had it just been, again, like a copy paste of images.
Right.
So
that's very cool. I love that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try that myself. Do you like a lot of collaboration with directors, or do you like to be left to your own devices in terms of lens length or shot list type of thing?
I think it just depends.
Yeah.
I think it really just depends. I think that there's the way that I like to approach specifically narrative projects, the last couple features I've done this, and I think it's been to really great effect, is we'll just spend the first 3 or 4 days of prep just going line by line through the script.
Yeah.
And it's not with any conversation about visuals. It's not, I really want to do this shot, or this reminds me of the way that this looks in this movie. It's merely do I understand the intention of this beat, the intention of this scene, the nuance of this moment, the sort of desires of the character, the making sure that when the director on day 17 is stuck in the trailer and the AD and the production designer are coming to me and saying, do you think she's coming out of this door or is she coming out of this door? And just being able to, because you are so much a, co-investor in the storytelling at that point,
right,
that it's just a shortcut to a lot of those conversations. And that to me is the best kind of collaboration that I have. I can talk lenses and lighting till the cows come home with a director, and I really enjoy it because it's obviously our vocabulary and it's our currency.
Right.
But I have to be on the same page of that story. I have to understand what we're intending to communicate.
Yeah.
Because then otherwise it's really just sort of arbitrary visuals that you're applying to a story that might not take it. And so I need to make sure that the intention of this scene is this, and not, oh yeah, you completely misread this,
right.
And not finding that out in the middle of a scene
Yeah.
that you're shooting.
For sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an important, you have to know where everything is emotionally for every scene, for the arc of the whole thing, for all of it.
It's honestly one of the more difficult things that I'm still dealing with commercials is a lot of times you just get boards.
Right.
And
yeah, completely.
And it's very much this almost kind of elementary rearrangement of images that you're saying, okay, so we're in a park, and then we're in a high rise, and then you're like, what is this spot about? And so really, and you're trying to just sort of piece those kind of image threads together. And so for me, it just, to be able to have just like that written word and that document, to begin with, and to say like, this is what's happening, and this is how you can read between the lines, and this is what's not being said, is just a very holy document. Yeah.
Do you like collaborating with storyboard artists too, as well as a director? Or prepping that way?
It's not as necessary for me because I can just go off of shot list with a director, specifically for narrative work. I feel like a storyboard is not as necessary for me. But in terms of commercials, it's obviously incredibly important because, there's a difference between a full shot of a person on a green screen versus a medium close-up of somebody on a green screen, and the kind of technical implications of all of those things.
Right.
So being really clear about those, because that's very much what the client is buying, is an important conversation for me to be a part of.
Sure.
But a lot of it really is just, getting on that location with that director and saying, yeah, I know this is how we thought we were going to shoot this, but if we rotate the set 90 degrees, you get a lot more value and a lot more visual interest out of looking in this direction. And I understand that might even restage the scene to a certain degree, but I think this is going to work.
Yeah.
And sometimes you fall flat on your face and it doesn't, but I think sort of taking those risks and speaking up in that way is what I'm there for.
Right.
So
no, that's invaluable for sure. It's very cool. Just wanted to ask you about some of your technical approach.
Sure.
Do you prefer to try to get everything in camera, or do you like a super flat raw image that can be pushed around in post?
I used to, I used to shoot, film. The
Right.
first feature I did was on film, and so it's just sort of it's a completely different approach in that way. But at this point, it's partly because of that experience. What I see on set is what I want to see on screen.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I usually light to a pretty tight range, both latitude and contrast. Obviously, whoever down the line can do what they will with it, and there's plenty of information on either side. I just have found that the more specific I've gotten in my preparation, and then in terms of the look that's presented on screen or on set, the less room for confusion there is at any point down the line. So just really being able to lock that in and then send that down the pipeline,
right,
really for me ensures that this is what it's going to look like.
If given the option, do you have a look that you gravitate towards naturally, or do you let the project dictate?
I think I try to let the project dictate. I really like higher contrast work, specifically in the look itself. So much recently, it's a very kind of like lifted blacks, and I think that classically I'm just much more drawn to a deeper, stronger, bolder black. But even just kind of going back into some of the film experience I've got, like black isn't actually true black. It's a sort of multiplication of a lot of different grain. So even kind of getting some activation in there has been really nice lately, and just working with some colorists to just be able to emulate that film look has been good.
Yeah, that's very cool. I feel like there's a trend now of like really dark images, low contrast, like zero edge light. It's almost hard to make out certain things in a frame.
Yeah, and it's because the tools allow that, and because both in terms of the capture tools, but then also the exhibition,
Right.
is that you're not watching it on a 4:3 SD 17 inch is your max screen in somebody's home. You can be a little bit more inventive with your framing, even if it's intended for television, because everyone's got massive screen TVs.
Yeah.
So.
Just out of curiosity, do you ever use a light meter when doing digital?
Yeah, I do all the time.
Nice.
And it's probably very much a what would be it's almost like a pacifier. Just having it on my hip is just something that's really nice. It's a nice way for me to just kind of be much more tactile with my process.
Yeah.
I mean, the last couple jobs that I've done have been exclusively crane work, and so I don't even touch the camera.
Right.
I'm nowhere near the camera. And so the light meter sometimes for me just helps me put myself back on set and back in that environment again.
Yeah.
And really just stop looking at screens and using your eyes and your kind of more classical reinforcements of the data,
right,
as opposed to just looking inside this little box and trying to understand why it's not working.
Right. And what sort of working relationship do you like with your gaffers? Do you like to be specific, or let them just stay big and soft and let them figure it out, or something?
It's a good question. I mean, I do so much international work and then just work outside of LA.
Yeah.
And so you get really used to speaking different languages in terms of how best other people work and how best you're going to collaborate and communicate. There's a campaign that I did last year with one of my favorite directors to work with, because we just have so much fun, but we light so differently from everything else that I do. And it's this the first one that we did was this very just like hot and hard and high key, like really like obvious shadows, and very just kind of think like late 60s James Bond, Hitchcock kind of look to it. And the gaffer that I had there, I literally just showed him one image, and we had a company move, and I show up at the next location, and it is just so perfectly dialed into a T, and it's like there's almost like sort of no room for error.
Wow.
Or margin in terms of just threading the needle of even where talent's going to walk. But that's that look when you're shooting, at an f8 and you're on a 35 millimeter lens and you're trying to hold somebody in close and somebody deep as well.
Right.
But then the crazy thing, we went from that to then we did that same campaign, but we did it in Portugal right afterwards. And I knew that I could have gone in and said, well, no, this is exactly what we did in Chile, and so you're going to replicate this look, perfectly, and these are the lights you're going to use. But I also knew that this guy was really, really good, had worked with a lot of really, really experienced cinematographers. And so when he was talking about, like, well, have you thought about this light? Or maybe would you consider this? I was like, well, I still really want to do this. But what was so interesting was that not only were his suggestions about these specific lights of solving those problems just so perfect and so like unique to the situation that we were in.
That's awesome.
But what I also learned from that experience was he brought so many other things to that shoot. I mean, for example, what happened was, I think it was a 15-hour day, and we started at dawn, and we went through midday with direct sun overhead, and we finished at nighttime. But it all had to look like it was 6:35, in the kind of like, midsummer, or, I guess it wouldn't be in Portugal, it would be probably more like 9:35. But it's got a specific time of light to it. But it was also in this very like heavy, high key look to it. But he had built all of these other sort of like secondary level controls to this pretty large space that then allowed, and they were, the color balance was correct, that allowed us to shoot uninterrupted in a way that then had this retention of contrast and color control.
Yeah.
That I think had I said from the beginning, like, no, you're going to light it exactly this way, and this is going to be the way that, this is how we did it in Chile, so this is how we're going to do it in Portugal, I wouldn't have also learned so much from him, and I think that he would have also not been so free to give me as much as he did.
Right.
So I've just really I've really taken that mentality Obviously I still have a job to do, and there's still enough that there's still what I know about lighting to be true, but I also always try to build in those opportunities to learn and to be surprised.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the great things about any film or commercial set. When everyone is hitting their stride and everything is clicking, it's so fun. It's like there's no better.
Oh, I mean, on that spot specifically, we were doing this specific camera move, and it was this like dolly and zoom in, and we intentionally like never made it perfect.
Yeah.
Right. So it would always kind of wobble at the end of the shot, and I could just hear Danny at the monitor, like 60 feet away around the corner, as I was rehearsing it, just like giggling his face off. Like, and I knew it was working, and it was just so. It's just, I think you're right. It's such a great example of just everybody's clicking and your brain is just so activated at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, it's that flow state that you hear about.
That you hope for and
for sure.
rarely attain. Yeah.
Isn't that true? Yes.
Yeah.
Do you like to be involved in the grade if possible?
Yeah. Yeah. It's the incredibly important component of the image, and it's just there are just so many ways in which if I'm not involved, it can go in so many different directions that I never intended or wanted. So if it almost more than anything else, it's like a stopgap. It's hey, we worked really hard in the development of this look and this approach. We shot it a specific way on set. We're now in the grade. Let's not get cold feet. Let's really see this through, as opposed to maybe working with people, and sometimes when the agency is in there, they're like, well, why don't we try this, or why don't we try this, and that's okay. And I think that you have to go through the paces of that sometimes to be able to also surprise yourself. But everything that you're seeing on screen is intentional and is a direct result of years of experience that brought it to there. It's not accidental, and so I really fight for that image to be able to be preserved in the way that it was intended.
I know that some cinematographers like to have their own sort of basic LUT. Mm-hmm. Do you have anything like that, or do you just kind of?
It depends on the job.
Yeah.
There is a. The LUT that I'll use for more kind of like high key beauty work is not the LUT that I'm going to be using for a more doc style commercial. Is not going to be the look that I'm using, or the LUT that I'm using for a car commercial. So they're still kind of coming from the same trains essentially, or just sort of trees. But I have a really great DIT. His name is Genenio Salucci, and he is just like. Is so patient with me because I will send him, we'll be working through tests, and I'll show him 10 different images, and like I said, he's very patient, but he's also very diplomatic to not tell me these are such contradictory images. And yet, like, just through conversation, we're able to really distill, like, hey, this is what's working with this. This is like, I want you to pay specific attention to this. Like, how much of this is going to be in the lens and how much of this is going to be in the grade, and finding that fusion is
nice. So do you have any personal mental prep or physical prep that you like to do for a longer project or even a grueling commercial?
I don't think I finished the story before. What I was saying, the thing about The Graduate is that the night before any big project, I'll watch The Graduate.
Oh, cool.
I've seen it so many times at this point that I'll try to be specific about the reason why I'm watching it. I'll be like, well, I just really want to watch their use of, it's so granular at this point, like lateral movement as or whatever it is, and within 8 minutes I'm just like completely sucked into the movie. And it just helps put me in the right place. It helps remind me that it's yes, the technical aspects are incredibly important, but you still have to tell a story. So the other thing that I've been doing a lot lately, the last couple of years, the night before I used to almost, I would cram and I would look at different videos and references and whatnot. And what I'll do now is I'll just cook. I'll just cook the night before.
Oh, I love that.
And it's still creative. It still lets the back of my brain be doing work and just kind of solving problems in a much more kind of subconscious way. There's still energy. It's not just completely, laziness that I'm just sort of vegging out, but I just really enjoy the creative aspect of it,
Yeah.
while then not also, draining my eyes out in front of a computer screen the night before.
Right.
So,
Sure. I
yeah.
love that.
Yeah.
Cooking has always been super therapeutic and a huge passion of mine. So.
It's incredible. It's even funny. My wife is an incredible cook. It's one of the first things I fell in love with her about. And we cook completely different.
That's interesting.
She can look at a fridge and a pantry and concoct and she'll go out to the garden and she'll just, pick the most magical gourmet meal. And for me, the way that I like to cook is the more complicated the recipe, the more sense of satisfaction I get from it.
Oh yeah.
So if it's a syncing up of 4 different dishes with 20 steps simultaneously, and they've all got to get in within essentially a 5-minute window, like that to me is like, oh, you've done it. It's just it's yeah.
Do you have a signature dish?
Oh man, there's a grilled rack of lamb that I really like doing. There's a salmon with this chili sauce that's like Thai chili that I
nice.
like. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you into French cooking with that
A little bit
of precision?
Yeah. No. I'm still learning, but there's a duck breast that I make that I'm pretty proud of as well.
Fantastic.
So, yeah.
There's this the commentary on, I think it's The Godfather 1, where Coppola. There's like a scene where they're cooking a pasta sauce,
Yeah.
and he's like, I try to put a recipe into every movie.
That's amazing.
So even if you hate the movie, you get a recipe out of it.
It's funny. There's the scene in Goodfellas where Paulie's in the jail and he's slicing
so
the
good.
garlic, and I can't. Even my mom, she's like, "Why don't you use a garlic press?" And I'm just like, I don't know how to explain it to you. Why I have to cut garlic this way, but this is how I have to cut garlic.
Oh, it's so good. I love it. That actually answered that last question. Like, what else are you inspired by? I guess that's pretty good.
It's actually funny. I've been taking piano lessons again lately.
Oh, cool.
I grew up. I played piano competitively for a long time, and then I just stopped. It just wasn't something that I was interested in. But I think it was really helpful for me to just kind of do a lot of simultaneous brain work.
Yeah.
That then also similarly, when you're operating, there's a lot of physical coordination. I played sports as well. And so I just read a book recently that, was literally about a person, who had kind of refound their love for playing the piano. And I had forgotten how much I had loved that and how therapeutic that was.
Yeah.
So I've started taking lessons again, and I can't stop myself now. And
that's great.
It's just so relaxing, but then it's a challenge. There are pieces that I had always wanted to play when I was younger that I, for whatever reason, had been told that I couldn't or whatever, and now it's just I'm working with a teacher who's just really encouraging and says points out the things that definitely are in need of improvement, but there's a confidence that comes from that of just saying hey, I want to learn this, and now being on the other side of 2 new Chopin pieces and just being like, this was not something that I even knew was possible for me before.
Right. Oh God, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I took piano for 5 years growing up and was sort of forced into it and reluctantly liked it, but I did find later on, cutting film or even thinking about directing, it's like, wow, there's a rhythm that you understand that
completely.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how it gets in you.
Yeah.
What's next for you? Any big projects?
Relaxing for a little bit.
Nice, good for you. I'm sure you've been traveling a ton.
Yeah, there's commercial stuff that's coming up, but no explicitly longer term projects. But that's what I'm on the lookout for right now. So. Do
you think you'd ever jump back into directing or not jump?
It's something that's always been interesting. I think a lot of it is just it would be more about finding the right story to tell.
Yeah.
I think what inspires me a lot about the directors that I do work with is that it is so clear when it's right that this is the story that they're meant to tell. Yeah. And that it's not just director for hire, it's, hey, this is personal and this is passionate and this is a story that only they can tell. I think I just haven't found that story. Yeah. To be, because it's just such a commitment. Sure. So
it is. It's like you got to live with it for 2 years. Yeah. At least.
Yeah. And there's something really wonderful about being a cinematographer.
Yeah.
Is, for better or for worse, is that you jump on and jump off. But what I've really been learning and enjoying much more is much more fully investing myself in those projects, even as a cinematographer.
Yeah. Maybe one last question. Is there anything you wish you would have known early on that you might tell a young cinematographer to think about or look out for?
Keep a low overhead.
Good advice.
Yeah. Some of the best opportunities that I had when I was in school and coming out of school, I mean, I was broke on student loans, but it was just, it was not having an expensive rent or a car payment or anything that was making it difficult to get up and just go. I mean, I was in Mozambique for 3 or 4 months when I was in school, just for that, just because that opportunity presented itself.
Right. Yeah, that's a good piece of advice for sure. Cool. Well, I really appreciate you doing this, Sean. Thank you so much.
Of course.
And I look forward to what you shoot next.
It was a pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.